and you come back, we'll all be gone.
Okay, we are recording. Okay, who is eating potato chips? Is that you, Michael?
Not potato chips.
Okay. All right, here we go. John is here. Hi, John. Good to see you. Let's start on page 39. And before we're just going to hit the conclusion. We finished actually the first third of the book. Isn't that amazing? So we're a third of the way through. We went through solitude. We're going to hit the conclusion and then move into silence. Is there anything left over from last week that anyone wanted to lead off with? Any lingering questions, concerns, insights, epiphanies, apostrophes?
I'm reading it over again.
Okay.
I
good.
like it a lot.
All right, well, let's hit the conclusion and then maybe you will think of something as we read the conclusion that you'll want to discuss as well. And then we'll dive into the next section. So Frank, go ahead and hit us with page 39, conclusion.
In a world that victimizes us by its compulsions, we are called to solitude, where we can struggle against our anger and greed and let our new self be born in the loving encounter with Jesus Christ. It is in this solitude that we become compassionate people, deeply aware of our solidarity and brokenness with all of humanity and ready to reach out to anyone in need.
You know, there was a phrase in that, just that paragraph, right in the first sentence that caught my eye. In a world that victimizes us by its compulsions. Is that an interesting phrase to you, or is it just me? A world that victimizes us by its compulsions. Is that,
I don't know if it's absolutely true or not.
well, that's what,
Seems,
go for it. Tell us why.
well, it just seems like it wouldn't be absolutely true because we're not always victims, and compulsions they exist, but not all compulsions are compulsive to certain people.
Okay.
So I don't agree with that statement.
All right. We have controversy. Anyone else not agree with the statement? Do agree with the statement? Have a nuanced in-between view of the statement?
Dave, what if instead if it said, in a world that can hold us hostage by its compulsions?
Yeah, I think I actually like that better. And so what's the difference to you, Becky?
It's not so absolute. It's
Mhm.
like it can, but it may not. And holding someone hostage is different than victimizing. I don't like that word.
Why don't you like the word victimizing?
Because to me, if you hold someone hostage, they still have choice.
You
Whereas,
still have a choice?
yeah, they still have more of a choice. When I think of victim, I think of someone who's really possibly is probably too many years of working with trauma, but possibly in a place where they don't have choice because they're just not able to rise above it or get out from it. Whereas holding hostage doesn't affect me the same way. It feels like there's more power in being held hostage than being victimized.
But if you're being held hostage, you know, if you're walking down the street and the van pulls up with the masked guys, get out and they put a bag over your head and tie your hands and throw you in, aren't you victimized and hostage at the same time?
What about a
Violated.
world? What about a world that is contaminated by compulsions?
Okay. So I take it from the objections here that you are not feeling that we are victimized by compulsions in the sense that we don't have any choice, but to be beholden to the compulsions. Is that kind of where you all are going?
To me, it's kind of sounding like culture is in a sense trying to absolve us for any responsibility of the choices.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, if you're a victim, I mean, that's what Becky's getting at, I think, probably all three of you, is that a victim is characterized by not having a choice, right? A victim has no choice, at least for the sometimes brief period that you're actually victimized. After that, as soon as you have a choice, as soon as you get a hand free in the back of that van, you can make a choice. It maybe the best choice is just to continue to pretend that you're tied up, but at least you have a choice. You can do something. And so it sounds like you all believe that we do have a choice, even in the face of the compulsions that we have to face.
I'd like to just throw in another thought. Having been in some interesting, to say the least, organizations, sometimes I did feel like a victim. Now, maybe that's some of my own past coming into play there. But, if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, you risked, I've been sexually harassed many times. You risk losing your job. A lot of bad things. So in an organization, in a job, in an organization, and some, not all, certainly the places I've worked during my life, but there are, a couple, three standouts that were pretty wild.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know, I did feel like a victim, but in like the broader context of society, I agree with what, Becky was saying, and Brady and Michael, and it, I don't know that I would feel like such a victim in that regard.
Got it. Well, like you, that phrase just kind of jarred me. That's why I wanted to talk about it a little bit. The way that I'm seeing it, that I think that he may be trying to get at, is that our compulsions are usually core beliefs that have been instilled in us, from childhood. And children really are victims. Children are the victims of the adults around them because they don't have any choice in the matter of what their home is like, their home of origin or whatever. And so a lot of these drives and compulsions are instilled in us before we had a choice in the matter. And then some of it is just basically human nature. The old lizard brain is going to go after those bottom levels of Maslow's hierarchy of need. And we don't have a lot of choice in that. So those are drives until we learn how to control them by becoming aware and by being able to make different choices. So I think that's probably the best spin that I can put on it, in terms of saying, yeah, I suppose we can consider ourselves victimized by compulsions that are subconscious and driving us. I think maybe the word that threw me was a world. I don't know if it's the world that's doing it. I suppose it's families of origin and circumstances. Maybe you can consider that the world too. But at any rate, as adults and as people who are looking to really accomplish some spiritual formation, that is our goal, is to work beyond these compulsions, whether they victimize us, hold us hostage, or how did you put it, Brady? What was yours?
A world contaminated by compulsion.
Yeah, or contaminated. However we understand that, our compulsions often are wagging the dog, and it's up to us to get to a place, and through silence, solitude, stillness, simplicity, through contemplative practice, to get to a place where we can open up the space between the stimulus and response and make different choices. But yeah, it's interesting. A lot of you had the same kind of initial reaction to that phrase as I did. It's like, wait a minute, is that really the case? Is that what's really going on? So,
Dave,
yeah.
I'm not sure if I really understand the statement. It says, in a world that victimizes us by its compulsions. Can you give me an example of something where the world victimizes somebody?
Well, I'm not using it in the world as you probably would think, but I mean, the world, human nature, human experience, early childhood development. I mean, it's just the way that we progress is going to put certain compulsions in place that we don't have conscious control over until we do the work and go through the process of becoming more aware. And so I'm using the world in that really broad sense, not in terms of the culture, the way Michael was looking at it, and maybe the way you're looking at it. Does that help at all, Scott, in terms of?
Yeah,
Yeah.
does clarify. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
It makes
ahead.
me think a little bit about the Enneagram work. There's one school of thought in the Enneagram is that every single personality type is formed in response to some form of trauma. And it's each type's response is kind of like the 9 different ways that there are 9 different expressions of human character in response to stress and trauma, basically. And they become compulsions because they become unconscious ways of managing ourselves and the world around us that defaults to a particular pattern without us being aware of it, basically. So when I think of compulsions, I think of the conversation we had with Nina the last time she was here, which is this idea of motivation without awareness, as the compulsion that victimizes us. And when he says the world victimizes, my understanding is that we're victimizing ourselves as well as others. It's not so much like, I don't think of it as the world as an external thing, but it's just any compulsion creates problems, whether it's from ourselves or other people.
Mhm. But talking about, going off what you just said, if our compulsions are the reaction to some trauma, that would be external to us, the trauma, the circumstances we find ourselves in that have to be overcome by using some personality traits. So, we can broadly consider that the world, I guess.
Right.
But I think that's where he's going. And then, of course, then the flip side of that is, we are called to solitude, where we can struggle against our anger and greed. That's kind of his, catch-all for the compulsions we face, and let our new self be born in the loving encounter with Jesus Christ. And it's in the solitude that we become these compassionate people. And that awareness is so key, deeply aware of our solidarity and brokenness, so on and so forth. So it's going to be this contemplative practice, the silence, the solitude. He breaks it down into silence, solitude, and prayer. We've been talking about the 4 S's: silence, solitude, stillness, simplicity. But it's going to be in that kind of space where we can open up this awareness that allows us to move beyond the unconscious compulsions, brings all this stuff up where we can actually deal with it in a responsible way, in a spiritual way. But yeah, William, that take on the Enneagram sort of bolsters the idea here that we're talking about. Are you buying that argument, by the way?
I don't have a problem with it. It's not my favorite sentence in the book, but
No. I meant the Enneagram. Do you see the Enneagram types as a response to trauma?
I don't like thinking of it in that way for some reason. And I think my my type 9-ness wants to smooth the edges of the Enneagram.
So in other words, the Enneagram is the trauma that is now enforcing your 9-ness, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I got you. I'm with you now. I read between those lines.
But it's a really interesting way to think about it. Like I think of like the type 9 on the Enneagram as disassociating in response to trauma. And by disassociating, you don't remember the trauma. You don't remember the details of the trauma. So I meet a lot of type 9s that I work with who don't remember really having a traumatic childhood. but in the work together, you hear some pretty traumatic stories. And they just kind of remember them differently, you know? So in my clinical work, I'm granted I'm working with a skewed population. I'm working with the group that needs help from a psychologist. That's why they're coming to me. But in that work, I'm seeing the presence of the trauma as a catalyst for crystallizing personality types, basically.
Okay.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So it kind of becomes a chicken and the egg thing, you know?
Yeah.
Did the personality type, is that kind of, does that come first and becomes a repeated reaction to trauma, or did the trauma create the personality type? You know, it's that's an
Yeah.
interesting question. So
I think of that what I recall, William, on the Enneagram, and I always liked this phrase, was I think it's the chicken or one of them that came first, the style of the person is first, because they say it's how you show up. So your style that you are really is how you show up to life. So if you're showing up to life to respond to the trauma, your number might respond differently to that trauma than another number. So
right. And I have always liked that idea. Like, we have a disposition that we come into the world with. Even as babies, we have a disposition that moms can tell right away. Even before you're born, the mom can tell that you're doing a lot of kicking in there and moving around and so on. So yeah, there is some sense to that. And that's kind of why I push back against the trauma forming the personality idea. And I think it's a little bit of both, basically. It's your disposition, the disposition of the child meeting the disposition of their caregivers. And what that's going to look like is going to forge the personality. So,
okay, so regardless of whether we're victimized or not, of whether the world is doing it or we're doing it to ourselves, one thing we can probably agree on is that we do end up with compulsions. We do end up with unconscious core beliefs, and they do drive the bus, even though we think that we're got this all figured out in our minds. And the only way to move through those is going to be through some type of process that quiets us down and gets us back into a different space. And that can be contemplative practice, it can be the psychodynamic practice, but it's got to be some kind of process that allows us to move into different space beyond just our cognitive thinking. And so this is what he's talking about, of course, and from a spiritual point of view and from a Christian point of view, he calls it the loving encounter with Jesus Christ. You know, but it's going to be in the silence and solitude that we're able to start to work through these things. All right. So let's continue, Frank.
The end of Anthony's story shows him, after years of compassionate ministry, returning to his solitude to be totally absorbed in direct communion with God. One of the desert stories tells us about a certain old man who asked God to let him see the fathers. God heard his prayer, and the old man saw them all except Anthony. So he asked his guide, "Where is Abba Anthony?" He told him in reply that in the place where God is, there Anthony would be. It is very important for us to realize that Anthony concluded his life in total absorption in God. The goal of our life is not people, it is God. Only in him shall we find the rest we seek. It is therefore to solitude that we must return, not alone, but with all those whom we embrace through our ministry. This return continues until the time when the same Lord who sent us into the world calls us back to be with him in never-ending communion.
Okay, so the shape of Anthony's life is to start in the noisy village in which he lives, to be called out into a place of solitude. So he moves from his family's home to a little hut on the edge of town. He lives there for a number of years, and then he goes further from there into the desert. And then after couple decades of time in the desert, when he's really conquered these compulsions, he comes back to the village and operates for decades in ministry. And then at the end of his life, he goes back into solitude. And that shape is pretty typical. In fact, even with Thomas Merton, if you follow the curve of his life, he goes into the monastery, into cloister, but he becomes involved in the community life within the abbey at Gethsemane. And so he was actually the novice master through the 60s, and he was teaching the novices as they came in, and very involved in the life of the community there. But toward the end of his life, he petitioned the elders to allow him to go into the hermitage, again, at the edge of the property that they had. And he went into solitude toward the end of his life. And of course, he didn't know it was the end of his life. He kind of died prematurely, but you see that same shape. And it's interesting now, if you are reading anything about Richard Rohr, at this point in his life, he is moving into more and more solitude and is living in a hermitage as well. And so there's a shape to that, where you go into solitude, you move into ministry, and then you move back into solitude. And it's sort of the shape, I suppose, of all of our lives. As we get older, the phone kind of stops ringing, doesn't it? You get older and things narrow down. The opportunities and all the busyness just kind of comes down to a finer point, and we find ourselves alone. And if we're not prepared for that, that can be absolutely devastating. It can just drive you nuts because you're no longer relevant, right? And we've been talking about this relevance, but it is so difficult to feel that suddenly, you're over the hill, nobody needs you, you're not relevant, and everything that you've done is not something that's valued anymore. And if we're not prepared for that, that can be a real devastating time. It's contemplation in the silence and solitude. Why do we fear death? Because at the point of death, everything that the egoic mind counts as itself ceases. And what continues after that? I don't know if you've ever heard contemplation sometimes called the little death, but it's the little death in the senses we're practicing by stepping away from the egoic mind for the moment when we really step aside from the egoic mind. And so it's kind of practicing for that moment and realizing that there's still something intensely there, even as the phone stops ringing and many of the egoic activities start to whittle down. So it's kind of an interesting shape, but it's actually every man and woman shape. It's just the shape of our lives. I thought there was one other really interesting line here that you may or may not agree with. The goal of our life is not people, it is God. Anyone have a problem with that one?
Yeah, that one rubbed me a little wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, not in the sense of that we're to put God first, but if you look at the Judaic concept, it was all about community, practicing your faith through community. So I don't know, it just kind of rubbed me a little bit wrong there.
Yeah. I see some other heads bobbing up and down. Anyone want to comment on your nodding?
I don't think you can do God without doing people.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
I just say,
Me too.
And you talk so much, Dave, about connection in our lives. It seems like, and the way we love God is by loving other people, at least on this planet, and then maybe we move to something else,
Yeah. And that's exactly how it struck me. I mean, I made the note right away down here that, but as I thought about it more and bringing in some of the Merton that we read last week, do you remember, and I should have pulled it up so we could actually read it, but Merton was making the point, and this is the point that I'm always making about love. Love's not a feeling, love's not behavior. Love is identification with the beloved. And actually that comes right out of the introduction to his wisdom on the desert that we read last week. But he was talking about the fact that if love is just about doing good deeds to the other, you automatically create a subject and object situation. If your idea of love is doing good deeds to another person as a good deed, then you're creating the separation of the subject and the object. And the truth of the matter is that real love, and as we approach perfect love, it's just perfect oneness, perfect unity and connection. And the idea is that the beloved and the beloved are really the same thing. And so the behavior that flows out of that is not even conscious of being a good deed. It's kind of like a mother with a newborn. I mean, she's not thinking that she's doing a good deed when she's changing diapers or feeding or just snuggling with the child and holding the child. It's just natural. It's a part of her. It's who she is. And so to think of that subject and object just kind of goes away. And I think since he's talking about ministry here, there can be to the minister the idea of their calling as a job in which they are doing all of these things for these people, and even unconsciously creating this subject-object separation. And we all know the separation is the sin. You know, it's not unlawful behavior. It's whatever causes us to separate. And so I think his line here is apt in the sense that if we start to see our work with other people, the cause of the work with other people, as the sum total of our purpose here, then we're missing the point, because it's really the unity between us and each other that is the point. And that's God. So God is the perfect unity. So in that sense, you know, our main point is experiencing and identifying with the unity of God, which extends to everyone. And then it becomes a both and situation and not an either or. He kind of set it up as an either or, which is something that I don't like, you know, and that's why it's stuck in my craw as well as many of yours. It's not an either or, it's a both and. But also we need to recognize that if we are trying to love other people as an object to which to do good, then we're recreating the separation between us and them, if that helps at all.
I like that. That actually reminds me of some more Enneagram speak.
Hey, of course it does.
There's a line relating to the type 2 on the Enneagram, which is the giver. And the givers are the ones that struggle with pride. That's how they disconnect because of this. I think that separation you're describing there, Dave. And the line was something along the lines of, the giver needs to learn how to stop acting lovable and allow love to act.
Oh, that's nice.
That's good.
That's good.
Again, we need that on the fridge.
Yeah.
Say it again, William, one more time.
Stop acting lovable and allow love to act.
Lovely. Yeah,
It's wonderful.
that is so right on. I love that. You know, that's right to James' idea of the law of liberty, right?
Mhm.
When you're living the law of liberty, there's nothing to obey, right? Kind of love God and do as you please. It's that whole thing that kind of wrapped up in there. That's a great way to put it. I really like that. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully that kind of helps, because it is in the unity. And the only way that we are going to experience this unity is when we get silent. You know, it's interesting that silence and solitude engenders the sense of connection with everyone and everything, because solitude is understood as not being alone, but alone with God, alone with unity, connection. And we have to kind of go away and into a separate space in order to be able to understand how we are all connected. And that changes everything, because then love can act, and we're just not acting always. And especially I think for clergy, it can really be a problem, because there's the business of church, there's a business of ministry, and it becomes such a subject object kind of thing. You know, like any other business that you engage in, it looks different once you're doing it for a while, and it changes things, and we can lose the sense of connection. So that's the best spin that I can put on that one. So the cure for all of this, of course, he says, is solitude. And then he's going to say silence is what is the action of solitude, which is kind of an interesting way to put it. So we'll read that in a bit here. But how does solitude make us compassionate? How does that work? Now I got 4 points here, and so I'll just kind of rattle them off, and let's see if they make sense to you. How does solitude make us compassionate? How does solitude connect us? with each other in a way that compassion flows, love acts in that way. And I think the first thing it does is it helps to, and it ultimately does, break our identification with the egoic mind. That's first and foremost, until we realize that we are not that voice that speaks to us in our head, that is not the sum total of who we are. Whenever I ask someone to tell me who they are, they always come back with the roles that they play, the accomplishments that they have achieved, and the attributes that they display in their lives. Kind of like the Enneagram wheel. What are the attributes? Because that's all the egoic mind has to work with. And we think that's who we are. Contemplation, spending time in silence and solitude, is what breaks that down. And we realize that there is a deeper connection. And once we have that deeper connection, we realize that is the same self, that deeper self that connects everyone to everyone. The egoic mind, imagines that it is different and separate. But the deeper self understands the connection. And so breaking the identification with the egoic mind is what starts us on the path toward being compassionate. The second thing, it shows the illusion of dualism. We imagine through our egoic minds that everything is separate and in competition with each other or in opposition to each other. But as we move into this deeper self and more identification with the deeper self, we're starting to see the connection of everything to everything else. The third thing, I think, is that it exposes our core beliefs. It exposes those compulsions and those programs for happiness, the ones that we've been talking about here in this little conclusion. And again, Thomas Keating put them out in three ways. It was our drive for security and survival, affection and esteem, and power and control, which kind of correspond with Maslow's lower hierarchy of needs. Those are all ingrained. They're part of the lizard brain. They're just part of our biology. And then you add on to that the core beliefs that we learned starting as children in reaction to the trauma and the difficulties that we face. But the process of contemplation starts to expose those for what they are and help us to, again, to be able to create that space between stimulus and response and choose differently. So in sort of a cognitive behavioral way, we can start to change our thought and behavior patterns. And then finally, it reframes our identification in terms of connecting with each other, and that our identification in each other and everyone else on the planet becomes the basis of our identification rather than just in ourself as a separate entity. And that is pretty much a definition of compassion, if you will, this solidarity with others that Nouwen talks about. So I think it's those four things: to break our identification with our egoic mind, to begin to expose the illusion of dualism in the world, expose our core beliefs and compulsions, and reframe our identification in terms of everyone and everything else. Contemplation and the contemplative practice can do that for us. And I think that's really what's in operation. What say you? Is that making sense? Not making sense? Comments? Should have had that written down someplace so you could see it. You're really going to give me the last word on all of that? That's terrible. So we're all in agreement? Go ahead, Mike.
Just letting it sink in a moment.
Okay.
Dave, I don't disagree with any of that.
Okay, but
or and I also, maybe this is just me, but for me, I've always been able to feel my connection of God through my loving people.
Through what now?
Loving people, being in any relationship, that's where I feel God's love and connection and everything. And so it feels like what this author is saying is there's one way, and this is how you get there. And I have a bit of a reaction to that. And I'm not saying that that isn't the way, but I'm also wondering if there aren't many ways to the mountaintop.
And I completely agree with you. I think, though, that there are still going to be components of solitude and silence and stillness and simplicity, even if we don't take it to a cloister, and even if we don't take it to a place of physical solitude. And in other words, I kind of have moved in the last 25 years from this more kind of cloistered and offline practice of contemplation to a Brother Lawrence idea of contemplation. And for the last, I don't know, at least 7, 8 years or more, I've really moved away from centering prayer and meditation time as the center of my practice, and more into the practice of presence throughout the day and with the people that I'm working with and everything, and finding the connection there. And it's only been in the last, I don't know, year and a half, where a lot of intensity has kind of gotten, the pressure is kind of put on, that I've realized I need to start adding in some carved out meditation and centering prayer time again to kind of bolster that, because I started to feel myself, running into the ditch. And so, but I really prefer the Brother Lawrence school. And I think that's kind of what you're saying too, Becky, is the connection with each other. But I suppose I spent enough time to be able to at least bring my silence to the relationships and to the work that I do. I don't know that I could have just done the Brother Lawrence method as the jump off point. But I understand what you're saying. And I think if we know what the principles are, then we find ways to fold those principles into our lives, because each one of us has different details to our lives and different work that we do. But if we know that a sense of solitude and silence and stillness is going to be important in being able to help us to, again, break the connection with the egoic mind, see the connection of everything that we're doing, then how do we incorporate that in a way that makes sense for us? Because we're not going to go out into the desert, well, you four have, but
We might.
you're still doing it from the air-conditioned comfort of your home.
That's true.
The only way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I
Dave, I'm
get what
thinking,
you're saying, Becky. Yeah, go ahead, William.
I'm thinking that we can have these, agreeing with everyone who talks about, where there's two or more gathered, you'll find me there, that kind of spirit of, having this interpersonal human connection. And we all know when that's nourishing us in some way, and we can feel the presence of God in that. But they could also be a lot of compulsions, like the compulsions the way we're describing in those everyday interactions. And, we're nourished by the social connection, of course, but we might still be, even in conversations, on autopilot, 95% of the time, if not more. And I think part of where the ego comes from, or part of where the ego gets crystallized, is as it's reflected by other people. You know what I mean? So what I'm saying is that I think you can't really get a full grasp of the presence of the ego and the functioning of the ego without the solitude piece. I think in social interactions, the ego is going to be reinforced in those interactions in some way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly found that true for myself. I mean, I needed to practice solitude, and fortunately, I was living alone at the time, and so I was able to, turn my little apartment into kind of a monk's cell to a certain degree, and shut down all the noise and shut down all the media, and practice that. so that I was able to take it out into my interactions. And so that has proven true for me. And but I think every one of us needs to find that way. Solitude can be interior. It doesn't have to be physical, but it's a lot easier to find interiorly if it's also in your physical environment. You know, but there has to be that sense. And I agree with you. Our social interactions reinforce the ego because it's the ego that is the interface, if you will, between us and everyone else and the rest of the world, and necessarily so. So how do you use that tool and not over-identify with it at the same time? That's always the tricky question.
I think part of the solution to that is just a constant awareness of the distinction between one's true self and the ego mind. To realize that there's this mechanism that is on 24/7, but to be able to always recognize, even as I speak right now,
Yeah.
you know, I know what I'm wanting to say, but it's the egoic mind that is skilled in finding words and delivering them. But I think it's just to be aware that, still to always be aware of the distinction.
Yes, absolutely. But it's hard to build that kind of awareness when you're in the fray, you know, when you're in the battle, so to speak. It's hard to build that. That's why offline time, meditation, centering prayer is usually the first step to start to build that kind of awareness and that distinction you're talking about, you know, between the egoic mind and the true self. But it's not impossible to do. You know, I love that image that the woman had about the sensory walk, where you go on the walk, but you don't name anything that you see. And I thought that was a perfect way to put it, because you can be aware of something without thinking about it. And that is the subtle distinction of what we're talking about. You can be in a conversation completely connected with the person, like Becky's talking about, and aware of the connection and aware of God's spirit, you know, in the midst of it without thinking about it. And in fact, that's how you're really present to it. As soon as you put words to it, as soon as you have a running narrative about what's going on, you created a subject and object again, you've stepped away. And so, yes, it's not impossible to do, but without some practice in more ideal circumstances, it is difficult.
In fact, I've heard a story that illustrates this nicely, I think. There was a guru, I guess, in China, and he had his followers coming after him, and they came up to the side of a river, and there was a woman there who was very sad and depressed because she couldn't get across the stream. And so the guru just like put the lady on his back and went through the water and set her on the other side of the stream and was walking. And then his followers, you know, came out of the water, and one of the guys asked me, he said, you know, teacher, why did you carry that woman across the water? And then the teacher said, you know, I put that down half a mile ago. Why are you still carrying her?
John, could you say that last part again? You cut out a bit.
Yeah.
Oh,
So we got to what did the teacher say to the follower when he or she, I don't know who it was, start at that point, if you would.
oh, I basically the teacher sets the woman down, and then the followers ask why he did that, and then he just says, "Why are you still carrying that woman with you? And I set her down, you know, half an hour ago."
Okay.
Got it. Thank you. Interesting.
There's so many different ways to look at this, but I think the principles are what we want to try to extract. You know, that it's going to be in some form of silence and solitude that we start to make these distinctions for ourselves. And as Brady was saying, it's that constant awareness of where we are. You know, are we connected? Are we back off in mind wandering land? Are we in our egoic minds? Or are we using the tool for what it is, but able to have that second sight, that is also seeing the connection at the same time. And once we have established the connection with everyone around us, then we're automatically compassionate. That's sort of the definition of compassion. And so then the love will act. We don't have to make it happen. It's going to just be a part of who we are if we are living the connection. And that has to be established through the silence and solitude that disconnects us from the distraction, the monkey brain. And so that, I think, is the way that it functions, the way that this solitude functions to make us compassionate, to inform us of the connection of everything. And of course, along with the solitude needs to come silence. So let's see, we got 15 minutes. In fact, Frank, why don't you go ahead and read the introduction to silence on starting on page 43.
When Arsenius, the Roman educator who exchanged his status and wealth for the solitude of the Egyptian desert, prayed, "Lord, lead me into the way of salvation," he heard a voice saying, "Be silent." Silence completes and intensifies solitude. This is the conviction shared by the Desert Fathers. A charming story about Abbot Macarius makes the point quite well. Once the abbot Macarius, after he had been given the benediction to the brethren in the church at Sidi, said to them, "Brethren, fly." One of the elders asked him, "How can we fly further than this, seeing we are here in the desert?" Then Macarius placed his finger on his mouth and said, "Fly from this." So saying, he entered his cell and shut the door.
So we have these basic levels, just like, was it Arsenius or one of them who asked, from Rome, how do I get closer to you, Lord? How do I find the way of salvation? And he says, fly. And so he goes into the desert. Then he asks the same question again once he gets to the desert. Okay, now how do I get closer to you? And he said, be silent. And so there's these levels. Once we obtain a certain amount of solitude, now where do we go from there? We go into silence. From the silence becomes an interior stillness and the simplicity that is part of this type of lifestyle. And so there's going to be stages and levels that we move deeper and deeper into this place. And you'll see that mirrored in the stories from the Desert Fathers and Mothers as well. Okay.
Silence is a way to make solitude a reality. The Desert Fathers praise silence as the safest way to God. "I have often repented of having spoken," Arsenius said, "but never of having remained silent."
There's one for the refrigerator.
Archbishop Theophilus came to the desert to visit Abba Pombo, but Abba Pombo did not speak to him. When the brethren finally said to Pombo, "Father, say something to the Archbishop so that he may be edified," he replied, "If he is not edified by my silence, he will not be edified by my speech."
Don't you love this? I mean, wouldn't these people just be absolutely maddening? Gosh, and just trying to, do the normal things that decorum and all of a sudden dictates, but, so politically incorrect. But you got to love it. I mean, that is a perfect answer. But imagine how frustrated everybody would have been by that. Especially when the Archbishop comes calling. Oh my gosh. All right.
But even as the way you describe that, Dave, like the decorum of social interactions is part of the compulsion we're talking about here.
Oh, absolutely. And we're seeing the clash between the egoic response and the contemplative response, aren't we? I mean, this is classic. I mean, good grief, it's the Archbishop. We got to make him welcome. We want him to think good thoughts about us. He may be able to feather our nest more. All these things that are going through the normal egoic mind, like any of us would, if a dignitary came to call, we pull out the red carpet and we want our elders to make nice and then you've got this response that is just coming from left field, but that's the contemplative response. And so there's that constant battle, right? And here it is, just laid out in these stark terms. And that's what makes these sayings and this way of life so relevant for us, even here now, 1700 years later. Finish it, Frankie.
Silence is an indispensable discipline in the spiritual life. Ever since James described the tongue as a whole wicked world in itself, and silence as putting a bit into the horse's mouth, James 3:3-6, Christians have tried to practice silence as the way to self-control. Clearly, silence is a discipline needed in many different situations, in teaching and learning, in preaching and worship, in visiting and counseling. Silence is a very concrete, practical, and useful discipline in all our ministerial tasks. It can be seen as a portable cell taken with us from the solitary place into the midst of our ministry. Silence is solitude practiced in action. In this reflection, I would like first to show how wordy our world has become. Then I want to describe the great value of silence in this wordy world. Finally, I hope to indicate how silence can be a sign of God's presence in the different forms of ministry.
So we've had a lot of refrigerator-worthy sayings and phrases here today. Silence is solitude practiced in action. That's a great line. Silence is a very concrete, practical, useful discipline in all our ministerial tasks. It can be seen as a portable cell. That idea of the astronaut in the pressure chute, taking the environment with him or her wherever they go. From the solitary place into the midst of ministry. So there's something about silence, interior silence, even as we move back out, even as we're practicing the Brother Lawrence form of contemplation. So we're actually out, we're in our kitchen, we're doing all the things that we normally do, but we're doing it with a different sensibility. And we're doing it with an interior silence, even as we leave the solitude and go back into the community. But we take this silence with us. And it's so important for us to make that distinction and be able to do that. An email, one of these blast emails from someone I connected with last year, hit my desk just this morning. And I want to read it to you because I think it kind of illustrates what we're talking about. Can y'all see that? Okay. Do you remember the movie Pulp Fiction? You don't remember that movie? There was there was a great scene between John Travolta and Uma Thurman where she's taping him, kind of videotaping him and talking to him at the same time. And she's asking him a series of questions. And one of the questions is, when you're having a conversation, are you listening or are you waiting to speak? And he said, I'd like to say I'm listening, but honestly, I'm waiting to speak. But that fine distinction, I think, is what David Welday here is talking about. But it also speaks to this interior silence that we can carry with us. He says the biggest communication problem we have is that we do not listen to understand, we listen to reply.
It's true.
Kind of the same thing that from the movie. I wrote down this phrase in my notes because I thought it was powerful and something that I need to remind myself regularly. I only wish I knew where I heard this so I could give proper credit. But regardless of who said it first, the statement I believe is nonetheless true. How many times have you caught yourself thinking of the answer you intend to give even before the other person pauses to take a breath? I know I'm guilty. How often have I sat quietly listening to someone else share, mainly because I count on them giving me the same courtesy when it's my turn? Sadly, we are often not really that interested in what someone is saying to us, but we sure hope that what we say has the desired impact and dazzles the other party. Sigh. If most people think this way, I suspect not much will ever get done. There have been books written and seminars taught and probably a lot of money made on effective communication. I doubt I will share anything here that hasn't been said 1,000 times before and probably in more compelling ways. So let me offer this simple reminder. Whatever you want to accomplish, whatever goals you desire to achieve, whether in business, finances, ministry, or relationships, you likely will not achieve these goals alone. You need other people. You need to work with other people. And people out there also need you. And anytime we are forced to work together, that requires communication. When communication is a contest where you win by getting someone to agree, listen to you more, or succumb to your way of thinking, I submit that you've already lost. My wife and I sometimes meet with young couples contemplating marriage to do premarital counseling. I let both sides know that their goal in communication is not for one side to win, but that the marriage wins. Both sides working and communicating together so that the relationship thrives. That is a higher, more noble objective than for either side to get their way or win over their partner to their way of thinking. So the next meeting or intense conversation you have, go into that conversation with the goal, not that you will convince the other person, instead listen genuinely, hear the other person. You should both be clear in the objective of working together to accomplish or achieve whatever sparked the need for the conversation. And when you do that, then a communication win is indeed possible. You know, I just like the way that he put that in the points that he's making, because it speaks to an interior silence, that interior silence that actually allows the other person in. Our egoic minds create a force field around us, and everything bounces off of it, and genuine communication and connection is no longer possible. But if we can create the interior silence and obviously listen in conversation, but also just be aware of what's around us in a deeper way, then everything starts to change. And so this silence can be practiced even as we are in the midst of everything that we do during the day, the conversations we have, the work we do, the traffic jams that we have to negotiate, all of that, we can carry this silence around with us if we are aware. And if we are practicing the awareness and maintaining that kind of silence and connection. And it starts with a solitude and it moves into silence, and then we take it and bring it out into the world, Brother Lawrence fashion, I think. So hopefully that helped to start to put this together. We did it. We're at time. Any quick last thoughts?
Thank you.
All right.
Oh, that's
Okay. Well, then we will continue with silence next. Hey, Jerry's back. Look at that.
Hi, Jerry.
From her hospital bed. Ah, Jerry, nice to see you.
Dave, just one quick comment I was thinking as
Go
you
for
were reading that. I mean, you know, we all talked about communication, how to communicate in our work environments and all this for thousands of years. And, you know, it's just disappointing sometimes to me that you watch all these movies or you see, you know, there's people out there with famous quotes that they're known for, and this person got the last word and the music comes on in the movie and everything is so grand and egoic like, and you know, there's probably not much listening going on in those scenarios at all. And it's all about who got the last word and what did they say that was so powerful, and you know, it just seems artificial. And so this kind of communication is so much more powerful, but probably not revered as much as it should be. The silence, the quietness in between, you know, I can't tell you thousands of times people would say to me in my work environment, well, that guy sat at the end of the table and he never said a word, that he's a loser. It's like, that's what you're saying about this person just because they sat there and listened and didn't say anything? I mean, that, you know, that it's that kind of thing that we have all these kinds of reactions to this kind of stuff. So it's a very hard hurdle to overcome, I think.
That's a great point, Kathy. And that's the problem with our culture. We don't revere silence. We actually are afraid of silence. And we're afraid of silence because when we're in silence and solitude, we actually have to face ourselves. We don't have the luxury of the distractions that keep things pointed outward. We actually have to take a look and start to evaluate things. And that's what contemplation is all about. But we don't value it. Just like you said, people will think you're a loser if you are silent. And people will rush to fill any silence, you know, in a conversation or in a group setting. It's painful for us to endure silence. That's what we want to, as individuals, overcome. Make friends with silence, make friends with solitude, simplicity, stillness, because it's in that we start to actually grow in terms of our real purpose.
And that's why I
Mm.
agree with the title of that chapter, Our Wordy World, because oh boy, it is. It's, yeah.
And he does a great job of developing that theme. And we'll read that one next week. Frank will have 2 or 3 pages he can read almost in a shot, because it just needs to, you just need to let it absorb. So we'll do that next
And you
week.
can't really make movies about silence.
I don't know. Kathy knows I've been on a tear about the movies that David Lynch, because David Lynch does transcendental meditation, 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon. And he says he doesn't like giving interviews about his movies. He says language doesn't capture what he's trying to communicate, that the only way to communicate what he's trying to say is to watch the film.
Yeah. Well, if you saw his the final chapters of his Twin Peaks, there was so little dialogue in there. It was bizarre images and all kinds of disjointed stuff, but there wasn't a lot of dialogue. So he was practicing what he preaches there, you know. And I just watched the second Blade Runner. I think it's Blade Runner 2049. Very little dialogue. You know, it's kind of, he's taking a page out of Stanley Kubrick's playbook from 2001. So little dialogue, but so much story, right? You're still getting the story, but without all the words. So there's something to be said for that, I think.
But there were a lot of people that
patience.
said, a lot of people said they couldn't stand Stanley Kubrick because it was too slow. They couldn't handle all the slowness, but they were missing it. They were getting it, you know.
Yeah.
I didn't like the second Blade Runner because I thought it was super slow. Like it just didn't hook me for some reason.
And you know, William, I thought exactly the same thing the first time I saw it. It was on the second and third viewing that I started to change my metabolism almost and move into the pace. And then I started to really see all that was there, because it's really deep. There's so much going on and exploring really deep themes. But yeah, I was expecting more of an action flick the first time, and I just didn't have patience for it either. So I know what you mean.
I'll give it another day in court.
Give it another shot. Give it another shot.
Twin Peaks, there's a scene, you may remember it, Dave, where 2.5 minutes, it's just this other guy sweeping the floor and is on the home.
I remember that, absolutely. Where does that ever happen anymore? You know, 2.5 minutes. Okay. Anyway, we are done for tonight. Scott, could you close us in prayer?
Sure. Father God, thank you for this time together. Thank you for the discoveries we make in sharing with each other and the encouraging of each other. The heart to just spend time with each other, because we know we're looking at you when we spend time with each other. Thank you for each person's desire to seek you with all their heart. Thank you for your calling in our lives. I just pray, Lord, that you show us each and every day your will, and then empower us with the things we need to do that will. Thank you for loving us, Lord. It's in your holy name that we pray, and we give our thanks and say our amens. Amen.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so your homework is to pummel Danielle with texts and ask her, where the heck were you tonight?
And did she buy a new car?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
In a loving way, in a loving way. Yeah, she might be on the side of the road someplace waiting for Uber. Oh, we know. All right, so check in on Danielle, and we'll see you guys on Sunday.
All right, guys. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey, Jerry.
Yeah,
How you doing?
I'm hanging in there, William. I'm trying to get over this pneumonia, but I'm hanging in there.
Bye. I didn't know.
Everybody. Well, you guys are just right across the, the harbor from each other. You ought to be visiting.
Yeah. Did you
Oh, you're on the East Coast?
I'm in Maryland. Did you get a tornado?
Oh, I was enjoying a nice rainstorm during the book study here.
Yeah, I've got one going on here too, but yeah, I got pneumonia. I had to go to the emergency room, so I've been pretty sick. So
No,
but I'm on the mend.
no COVID, just a regular.
Good news, no COVID. Bad news, pneumonia. All right, guys. Take
All right,
care.
everybody.
Bye,
Good
Jen.
night. See you
Night.
soon.
All
Bye,
right,
Jordana. Bye, Linda.
I'll
Bye.
see you guys next week. I won't see you guys
Okay.
Sunday, so I'll see you guys next.
Oh, that's right. Okay,
I'll
Jordana.
see you guys next Tuesday.
Alrighty.
Good night.
Bye.